He cuffed him without hesitation, convinced he was just doing his job, arresting yet another ordinary criminal. Cold, precise, no room for doubt. But fate has a cruel sense of irony, because years later, it was that same man, yes, the one he once chained without blinking, who ended up saving the one person he could never live without. What would you do if the greatest mistake of your life became your only hope? Sometimes, justice hides in unexpected places, and sometimes, the ones we call enemies are the only ones who can save us. Get ready. This story will make you question everything: guilt, redemption, and the power of second chances. And before we dive into this emotional whirlwind, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. Here, every story is crafted to move you deeply. Jacob had always been a rigid man, not because of the badge, not because of the gun on his hip, but because of what he carried in his eyes. There was no light there, only a shadow that had lived inside him for years, since the day something quietly died and never came back. He wasn't the type to smile in pictures. He avoided parties, spoke little, observed everything. Everyone at the precinct respected him, but few truly knew him, and none of them had any idea what kept him standing. His past was a cemetery of memories, buried but never forgotten. He had lost his wife, Rachel, on a stormy night years ago. A car accident. She was coming home from a short trip. He was supposed to pick her up. She insisted she'd be fine. He agreed. And from that moment on, he carried the weight of that decision like a sentence, a single yes he could never forgive. After her death, Jacob changed. He hardened. He became methodical. He buried himself in work just to avoid drowning in pain. But one thing anchored him to what was left of his humanity: Emily, his daughter. Emily was only 6 years old when she lost her mother. Jacob, unsure how to be both father and mother, made a silent promise that she would never go through pain like that again. He swore to protect her with everything he had. And he did. Every case solved, every arrest made, every late-night shift was for her. Emily grew up surrounded by care that almost felt like a cage. Jacob picked her up from school every day, even if he was barely standing. He read bedtime stories with a mind consumed by reports, and every birthday became a secret mission to make her feel seen, even without a mother. But as the years passed, Emily grew. And with that came distance. Jacob, used to control, couldn't handle the space. His trained eyes, so used to spotting threats, started seeing danger everywhere. A classmate, a smiling teacher, a delivery man who lingered too long. Emily felt it. And slowly, she started hiding pieces of her life. Jacob thought he was protecting her, but in truth, he was building walls. Still, their love was undeniable. You could see it in how he stood at her door at night, just listening to her breathe. In the way he kept every childhood note, every crayon drawing, every shaky birthday card. Those scraps of paper were his sanctuary, his faith. Then everything changed. A wave of violent break-ins hit the city. Homes invaded, families terrified. Jacob, like always, threw himself into the case, but something felt off. The victims weren't random. There was a pattern. He was dealing with someone clever, someone calculated, and after weeks of chasing shadows, one name surfaced: Marcus Hale, former military, a record, PTSD, petty theft. The arrest came on a cold night. No resistance. Marcus didn't run, didn't shout, just looked Jacob in the eyes when the cuffs clicked, and in that second, something wavered. There was no hatred, no fear, only a kind of tired sadness, like someone who knew he didn't belong anywhere. But Jacob didn't break. He brought him in, filed the paperwork, moved on like it was any other day. Another case closed, another threat gone, Another criminal off the streets. What he didn't know was that the man he cuffed without hesitation carried a story. A story he never imagined, one that would soon crash into his own. While Marcus waited for trial, Jacob felt something shift. A noise inside, a restlessness he couldn't ignore. He reviewed the case again and again, returned to the scene, re-interviewed the victims, and something didn't add up. There were cracks, gaps, inconsistencies, and for the first time in years, Jacob wondered if he'd made a mistake, but life kept moving. Emily was now in college, in another city. They still spoke every day. Jacob remained the ever-watchful father from a distance, and those quick check-ins, those little "I'm fine, Dad" texts were what kept him breathing. Until one night, the phone rang and everything broke. Emily had disappeared. She'd gone to a party, never came back. No calls, no messages, no signs of struggle, just silence. And an emptiness that dragged Jacob back to the darkest night of his life. The detective who had told countless parents, "We're doing everything we can," was now just a desperate father. He called every contact, pulled footage, checked every lead. Nothing. Time moved like a slow-burning fire, and hope was slipping away. Then, a call came from the prison. Marcus Hale wanted to speak with him. Jacob hesitated, but he went. And in that cold visitation room, from the other side of the glass, he heard words that stopped his heart. "I know where she is." Throughout his entire career, Jacob had grown used to being the man with answers, the one who arrived on the scene, read the silence of the victims, pieced the puzzle together, and delivered justice. But now, faced with the possibility of losing Emily, he felt like a man without ground, without direction, without identity. The tireless detective was crumbling from the inside, and with every tick of the clock, it felt like time itself was mocking his helplessness. Deep down, he knew. It wasn't the officer who was suffering, it was the father. And fathers, no matter how strong they are never prepared for the emptiness that comes from the absence of a child. The following days blurred together. Hours lost their meaning, and Jacob's mind spiraled between hope and despair. Search teams found nothing. Calls brought no answers. And fear, cruel, persistent fear, settled in every corner of the house, like it already knew how the story would end. And in the middle of that chaos, a memory surfaced. That recent encounter with Marcus Hale, the man Jacob had arrested months earlier. A man who appeared cold on the outside, but whose eyes carried a pain Jacob now recognized, because he was feeling it too. He began replaying the details of that meeting. The way Marcus said, "I know where she is," not with arrogance, but with a weight in his voice, a quiet sincerity that Jacob hadn't heard at the time, or hadn't wanted to. And that memory started eating away at the certainty Jacob had always held about his own sense of justice. Had he condemned the wrong man? As he reopened the case, everything began to shift. The pattern behind the crimes didn't align as neatly as he once thought. The evidence was circumstantial. And more than that, one of the victims, the only one who claimed to have seen the intruder's face, had given a description that didn't match Marcus. But Jacob, under pressure from the media and desperate to protect the city, had ignored that detail. He had wanted to believe he was right, needed to believe it. Now, though, doubt was a wildfire inside him, fueled by the possibility that his daughter was in danger. Because of a choice he made, despite resistance from his superiors, Jacob gained access to the prison again. Not to interrogate, but to understand. He needed to know who Marcus really was, needed to understand the eyes that suddenly made sense. When he looked into Marcus's past, he found what he had never bothered to look for before. The ex-soldier had been decorated for civilian rescues during combat missions. Yes, he had trauma, but he also had a record of courage and sacrifice. After being discharged, he'd tried to rebuild his life, but got lost, like so many veterans. There were minor offenses, but nothing that matched the crime he had been accused of. Jacob spent sleepless nights poring through data, rechecking routes, rereading reports. And then a new lead emerged, a string of disappearances with the same pattern as the earlier break-ins, but with one critical detail. They all happened after Marcus had been arrested. It hit like a punch to the chest. The truth crashed over him. Like an avalanche, Jacob had arrested the wrong man, and now his daughter's life might be in the hands of someone he had never even investigated. He had made the biggest mistake of his career, and worse, he feared it might be too late to fix it. But then, a final possibility. One of Marcus's few known acquaintances still out in the world was a former military comrade who had vanished from public records years ago. A man with an unstable profile, prone to paranoid outbursts, and who, according to old reports, blamed society for forgetting him. Jacob felt it in his bones. This was the one. He was the real culprit. With the name in hand, Jacob began a relentless pursuit. He cross-checked bank records, tracked cameras, hacked systems, not as a detective but as a father. He didn't care about rules anymore. He had one mission, save what was left of his world, and in that desperate search, he discovered something even more unexpected. Marcus, even behind bars, had been trying to protect people. He had sent letters, contacted lawyers, tried within his cell to prevent more victims, but no one listened. No one believed him, not even Jacob. The weight of truth fell on Jacob like a storm, because now, in order to save his daughter, he had to trust the very man he once destroyed. And that's exactly what he did. With emergency approval and under the judging eyes of his peers, Jacob arranged for Marcus's temporary release. Not because of protocol, but because he finally understood. This man knew the enemy better than he ever could, and Marcus, despite having every reason to hate him, accepted, not for forgiveness, but because he too knew what it meant to lose someone, and because deep down, he still believed it wasn't too late to do something good. Together, they followed trails others had missed. Marcus recognized patterns no one else could see. And as time raced against them, the two men, once enemies, became an unlikely alliance forged in desperation. The path led them to an abandoned cabin in the mountains, far from cell towers, far from surveillance, a place where pain hid in silence. This was it, the final thread of hope. As they stepped inside, Jacob felt his heart stop. For a moment time froze. Emily was there, weak, scared, but alive. And it was Marcus who reached her first. Marcus who carried her in his arms. Marcus who looked Jacob in the eyes and without saying a word, told him she was safe now. But the story wasn't over, because in that moment something in Jacob broke and something else was born. He had judged, condemned, destroyed, and yet he had been saved by the man he once handcuffed without a second thought. The silence inside the cabin was so dense, it felt like it was screaming. Emily's body, wrapped in an improvised blanket, trembled more from exhaustion than from cold. And as Jacob stood there, watching her, time itself seemed to stop. In the wreckage of what could have been the deepest grief of his life, there was a second chance, but what he felt wasn't relief. It was guilt. It was pain. It was the unbearable truth that, to arrive at that moment, someone else had carried a weight that never should have been theirs. Marcus, the man he had broken without solid proof, was now saving the one thing Jacob loved most. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a human being, one who, despite being torn apart inside, still believed he could do something right. During the rescue, Jacob could barely meet his eyes. The drive back was quiet. Every mile down that dirt road echoed in his chest like a verdict. With each turn, another flash from the past, the arrest without evidence, the signature on the report, the eyes he chose to ignore. Now it all burned like an open wound. Even when Emily was placed into medical care and the story spread across the media like wildfire, Jacob felt no victory. He felt shame. The police praised him. The headlines called him a hero. But he knew the truth. He had committed the most unforgivable error. He had taken the freedom of an innocent man, and only realized it when he nearly lost the only thing that truly mattered. As applause echoed on the outside, all Jacob wanted was Marcus's silence. And Marcus gave it, because even after everything, he asked for nothing. He didn't demand justice. He didn't complain. He simply returned to his cell without a single word. Not out of submission, but because he had already learned that, for men like him, justice almost never came from the outside. And that's when the real turning point happened. Not in court, not in headlines, but inside Jacob. For the first time, in decades, he understood that the uniform he wore didn't make him infallible. And maybe, beneath the appearance of strength, he had always just been a grieving husband, a broken father, a man shattered on the inside. Just like Marcus. In the days following the rescue, Jacob stepped away from the job, not because he was suspended, no one dared question his supposed heroism, but because he had to. He needed to relearn how to breathe, how to look in the mirror, without flinching. How to face the truth that he had built an entire career on certainty, without ever leaving room for doubt, and that blindness had cost him more than he could bear. While the city saw him as a symbol of bravery, Jacob wrote silent internal reports that would never be published. He documented every mistake, took responsibility for every choice, one by one, not to erase them, but to remember, so he wouldn't repeat them, and in parallel he launched an initiative within the department to reopen similar cases where arrests had been made on shaky evidence, where instinct overrode empathy. He knew he couldn't change the past, but maybe he could stop others from making the same mistake. What almost no one knew was that on sleepless nights, Jacob would drive to the prison. He wouldn't go in, wouldn't speak to anyone. He just sat in the car, staring at that cold, lifeless building, as if something inside it still held part of him. It was his silent penance, his twisted way of asking for forgiveness, until one gray afternoon, an envelope arrived at his house. No sender. Inside, a folded piece of paper, a pencil sketch. It was Emily, sitting in a field. Next to her was a man with a soft expression, looking out at the horizon. Neither of them smiled. But there was peace. On the back of the paper, one line, handwritten in firm letters. It wasn't for you, it was for her. Jacob held that paper for minutes, unable to move, and that's when he understood. Marcus hadn't forgiven him. And maybe he never would, but still, he chose to do what was right, because pain can consume us, or it can shape us. And Marcus, despite the scars, chose to be useful, chose to break the cycle, chose to be more than the mistake that had been forced upon him. That realization broke something inside Jacob. There was no way to go back, but there was still one step forward, and he took it. He began visiting Marcus in prison, at first in silence. He simply sat across the glass, sometimes for 15 minutes without a word, just watching, just listening to the presence. With time, he started speaking, not about the case, but about life, about his daughter, about the wife he lost, about how fear had become his way of loving, and how that fear slowly destroyed the very things he was trying to protect. And Marcus listened, not with pity, but with understanding, because he too had loved, and he too had lost. And in that quiet space between silent visits and hesitant words, something rare was born. Not a friendship, but a reconnection between two men the system had placed on opposite sides, two broken men, two men who, in different ways, had paid for things they didn't do. And in that place, where time seemed to move slower, Jacob finally saw the greatest truth of all: justice isn't always carried out with handcuffs. Sometimes it starts with an apology and ends with an act of humility. That truth led Jacob to do the unthinkable. He took the case to the district attorney, handed over every piece of evidence proving Marcus's innocence, signed a full report, admitting he had led a biased investigation, driven by fear and haste. He knew he might destroy his own career, lose respect, maybe even his freedom. But he had already lost everything once, and he knew he wouldn't survive a second guilt. The process was long, the judicial review slow. But months later, Marcus Hale's conviction was overturned. He walked out of prison through the same door he had entered, but this time there were no handcuffs. Only the silence of a man who had seen the worst of the world and still chose not to become it. Jacob was waiting for him outside, not to take him anywhere, but simply to be there. No badge, no gun, no uniform, just a man with his head bowed, willing to learn how to be better. The sky that morning looked different. A soft light filtered through the clouds, as if the world itself was starting over. Marcus walked out of prison with steady steps, but without a sound. He didn't look back. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't smile. Not because he felt nothing, but because he had learned that not every freedom comes with celebration. Some come with the quiet of someone who no longer expects anything, yet still chooses to walk forward. Jacob was there, standing at the gate in civilian clothes. His eyes held the same intensity, the same weight. But now, there was something else. Humility. There were no words between them, no need for gestures or greetings, just presence. A silent recognition that both had walked through hell, and somehow were still standing. In the days that followed, Marcus vanished from public view. He turned down interviews, book deals, television appearances. He wanted silence. He wanted peace, with help from an organization that supported veterans. And the wrongfully convicted, he found a place to start again. A small cabin near the mountains where the sounds were few and memories could finally rest. There, he reconnected with something he had forgotten: the earth. He planted, cared for trees, fixed things that didn't need fixing. Slowly, he learned to live with his past, not as a prison, but as a part of himself. He didn't need to erase it, just accept it. And through that, little by little, he began to breathe without pain. Jacob, meanwhile, returned to the police department, but in a different role. He left the streets, traded his badge for case files. He became responsible for a new division focused on reviewing old convictions. It was his idea, a personal effort to ensure that no other Marcus would be forgotten in a cell they didn't belong in. It was difficult work, slow, often ignored. But Jacob persisted, because every reopened case, every corrected error, was one brick less in the wall he had built around himself for so many years. He was finally beginning to dismantle the fortress that had once kept him from truly living. Emily changed too. Not just because of the trauma, though it lingered like a scar that never faded, but because of how she now saw her father. For years, Jacob had been her invincible hero, but after the kidnapping, that image cracked. And it was precisely that fracture that allowed her to see the man behind the armor. A flawed man, yes, but also deeply human. She started visiting more often. Their conversations grew longer, more honest, and Jacob, instead of overprotecting her, learned to listen. He learned that love isn't about control. It's about presence, being there when it matters most, even without all the answers. 1. Day, months after Marcus's release, Emily asked her father to take her to see him. She wanted to say thank you, not just for the rescue, but for doing the right thing, even when no one expected him to. She wanted to show him that there was someone on the other side of the pain who didn't see him as a former convict, but as a man who chose to be kind. The drive to the cabin was quiet. Jacob drove carefully while Emily watched the landscape pass by. When they arrived, they were welcomed by birdsong and the scent of damp earth. Marcus stepped out onto the porch, Anne's muddy eyes surprised. There was no hug. There didn't need to be. Emily held out a small plant pot she had brought, a sunflower seedling, a symbol of light, of rebirth. Marcus received it with a brief nod and a long look. And in that quiet moment, something was sealed that no words could ever reach. After that, each went their separate ways. But the connection remained, a quiet bond, invisible to those who didn't know the story behind it. With time, Jacob was invited to speak at conferences on restorative justice. He never saw himself as a role model. He simply told his story. He spoke of the pain of being wrong and the courage it takes to admit it. His words moved people, not through polished speeches, but through the weight of lived truth. He showed them that what builds a man isn't perfection, but the ability to rebuild. Marcus began contributing anonymously to support groups for former inmates. He wrote letters, donated part of what he grew, offered practical advice about reintegration. He never used his full name. He didn't want recognition. He wanted purpose. He knew he couldn't change what had happened to him, but he could help someone else avoid getting lost. And Emily began to write short stories, essays, pieces inspired by ordinary people with extraordinary pasts. Her words found a home online. Her readers said her stories healed, that they touched wounds others couldn't see. She never revealed that. Many of those stories were drawn from two men fate had placed face to face, men who could have destroyed each other, but chose to survive together. Years passed. Life moved on. The pain never fully left. Real scars never do. But it stopped hurting and began to remind them that mistakes are part of the journey. Remind them that forgiveness isn't always spoken out loud. Remind them that goodness can come from the most unexpected places. And most of all, remind them that everyone, at some point, needs a second chance. In the final scene of this story, there are no grand speeches, no applause, just 3 lives forever intertwined by one simple truth. Pain can break us or transform us. And there, in the quiet of the mountain, where the trees grow without hurry and the wind moves without noise, the transformation happened. Not like in the movies, but like in real life, slow, silent, deep, and above all, human. Some stories don't end with a period. They continue inside those who lived them, those who felt them, those who learned from them. And this was one of those stories. Jacob, Marcus, and Emily never went back to who they were before. But the truth is, they didn't want to. Because every pain they endured, every truth they uncovered, every silence they shared, built a new version of each of them, maybe more fragile, but definitely more real. And if there's one thing this journey teaches us, it's that not every mistake has to last forever, and not every judgment is final. Sometimes you have to lose everything to finally see, and sometimes it's the man you once handcuffed who ends up saving the one you love most. If this story touched you, share it. Leave a comment. Tell us what you would have done if you were in Jacob's shoes, or Marcus's. Because the more we reflect together, the more human we become. And if you think you've seen enough for today, think again. There's another story, just as powerful, about a young girl who was left behind as a child. But years later, when no one else came, she was the one who stayed, until the very end. You need to see this journey and understand why love, even when it seems gone, can be reborn in the most unexpected moments. Click now and stay with us, because here, every story is a chance to feel for real.